stale air in Bitter Creek always tasted like old copper and dried spit. Harlan felt the grit against his teeth every time he swallowed, a heavy reminder of 40 years spent dodging lead and digging graves. Now, a kid with a dead-eyed smile stood across the saloon, thumbs hitched in his gun belt. "Draw first, it won't matter," the stranger smirked. Harlan didn't feel heroic fear. He just felt an old, familiar exhaustion settling deep into his aching knees. It was going to be a long Tuesday. Heat baked the tin roof of the Yellow Rose Saloon, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. Harlan Wade sat at the far end of the chewed-up pine bar, nursing a glass of rye that tasted faintly of kerosene and wet copper. A solitary fly buzzed in lazy, jagged circles around the rim of his glass. He didn't swat it away. He lacked the energy. His right hand rested flat on the bar top. It was a ruin of a hand. The knuckles were swollen, twisted slightly off-center from decades of recoil, bar brawls, and the damp cold of winter plains. A lattice of pale, thin scars crisscrossed the sun-spotted skin. That hand had put 22 men in the ground, or maybe 23. Harlan had stopped keeping strict tally after the boy in Abilene, the one who had cried for his mother while holding his own spilling intestines. Harlan shifted his weight on the wooden stool, wincing as a sharp spike of pain shot up his lower spine. He was 54 years old. In his line of work, that made him an antique, an anomaly, a walking ghost. He was tired, a deep, marrow-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. He smelled the sour tang of unwashed bodies, stale beer soaked into the floorboards, and the sweet, sickly scent of cheap chewing tobacco from the man spitting into a brass spittoon 2 stools down. The swinging doors at the front of the saloon creaked open, admitting a blinding wedge of harsh Texas sunlight. The dust motes danced violently in the sudden draft. Harlan didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the cracked silver-backed mirror mounted behind the rows of liquor bottles. Through the spiderweb of fractured glass, he watched the silhouette step inside. The newcomer let the doors flap shut behind him. The sudden dimness swallowed his features for a moment. But Harlan didn't need to see his face. He read the posture, the arrogant, wide-stance tilt of the hips, the arms hanging loose, hovering just an inch too far from the body. It was the posture of a man who thought he was invincible, carrying a piece of iron that made him feel 10 feet tall. The low hum of conversation in the saloon faltered. A piano player in the corner, a half-blind man named Gideon, let his fingers drag across the keys in a discordant cluster of notes before resting his hands in his lap. The silence that followed was heavy, thick as molasses. Harlan took a slow sip of his rye. It burned on the way down, leaving a trail of uncomfortable warmth. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, the rhythmic clomp of spurs against the hardwood floor. Clink, thud, clink, thud. Through the mirror, Harlan watched the stranger approach. He was young, maybe 25. He wore a canvas duster that looked surprisingly clean, completely devoid of the white chalky dust that coated everything and everyone in Bitter Creek. His hat was pulled low, casting a sharp shadow over his eyes, but his mouth was visible. It was pulled into a tight, confident smirk. He didn't look like a local. He didn't look like a drifter either. He looked purposeful. "Barkeep," the stranger said. His voice was smooth, lacking the gravel and grit of the frontier. It sounded like it belonged in a parlor in Boston, not a dying cattle town. "Whiskey, leave the bottle." Clem, the bartender, a balding man with a perpetually greasy apron, cast a nervous glance toward Harlan before shuffling over to the stranger. He set a bottle and a relatively clean glass on the wood with trembling hands. The stranger poured a measure, but he didn't look at the glass. He was staring directly at the back of Harlan's head. "It's quieter in here than I expected," the stranger remarked to the room at large, though his gaze never shifted. "I was told Bitter Creek was a lively town. Told a man could find a reputation here." Harlan closed his eyes for a brief second. "Not today. Please God, just not today." He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a heavy, sinking stone of dread. It wasn't fear of dying. It was the absolute, crushing boredom of having to do this again. The paperwork, the questions from the sheriff, the dragging of a heavy corpse out to the undertaker's cart in this blistering heat. "Town's quiet enough if you leave it be," Harlan muttered, his voice barely rising above a rasp. He didn't turn around. The stranger chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I'm looking for Harlan Wade." Harlan ran his thumb over the condensation forming on the outside of his glass. It felt cool, a stark contrast to the stifling air. He didn't answer. "They say he's the fastest shooter in Texas," the stranger continued, taking a sip of his whiskey and grimacing slightly at the taste. "They say he pulled iron on the Miller gang and dropped 3 of them before the first casing hit the dirt." "People talk a lot of wind when they're drunk," Harlan said. "Are you him?" Harlan finally turned his head, just enough to look at the kid head on. The boy had pale blue eyes, flat and unreadable. The smirk hadn't left his face. It was pasted there, a mask of arrogance. He wore a custom rig, the leather tooled with intricate floral patterns, resting low on his right thigh. A pearl-handled Colt peeked out from the holster. It looked brand new. It didn't have the worn, polished sheen of a tool that had been handled, sweated on, and relied upon for survival. It looked like a toy. "I'm a man trying to finish a mediocre drink in peace," Harlan said, his tone flat. "Whatever reputation you're looking to build, son, build it on someone else. I ain't hiring." The stranger stepped away from the bar, moving to the center of the room. He pushed his duster back, hooking his thumbs loosely behind his silver buckle. The movement was practiced, theatrical. "I'm not looking for a job, old man," the stranger said. "I'm looking to prove a point." The saloon had completely emptied out of the center. The other patrons, cowhands, drovers, a couple of railroad surveyors, had quietly and efficiently slid their chairs back, pressing themselves against the rough-hewn walls. They knew the choreography of a gunfight. You didn't stay in the middle unless you wanted a stray .45 caliber slug in your gut. Harlan remained seated on his stool. He looked at the stranger's boots. They were fine leather, barely scuffed. The boy hadn't walked far today. Probably rode in on the train, rented a horse, and came straight here. "What point is that?" Harlan asked, his voice sounding tired, even to his own ears. "That the old guard is done," the stranger said. "That speed is a young man's game, and that the great Harlan Wade is nothing but a relic holding onto a ghost." Harlan sighed. It was a deep, ragged exhalation that ruffled his graying mustache. He rotated his right shoulder, wincing at the familiar popping sound the joint made. "You're right," Harlan said. The stranger blinked, the smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me?" "I said you're right," Harlan repeated. He picked up his glass and drained the rest of the rye. It tasted worse warm. "I'm a relic. My back hurts when it rains. I can't sleep through the night without waking up to piss. And quite frankly, my hands shake if I don't get enough coffee in the morning." He set the glass down with a dull clatter. "So congratulations," Harlan continued, turning fully to face the young man, his hands resting on his thighs. "You win. You're the fastest gun in Texas. Tell the newspapers, tell your ma. Now let me buy you a drink and you can get back on the train and leave me to my misery." For a moment, confusion washed over the kid's face. He had rehearsed this encounter, Harlan could tell. He had practiced his lines in front of a mirror, imagining a tense, dramatic standoff. He hadn't prepared for an old man simply agreeing with him. The flush of anger began to creep up the stranger's neck, staining his pale skin an ugly, mottled red. The smirk returned, but this time it was rigid, defensive. "You're a coward," the kid spat. Harlan felt a muscle tick in his jaw. The insult didn't sting his pride. He had discarded his pride somewhere in New Mexico a decade ago. But it irritated him. It was the sheer stubborn stupidity of youth, the refusal to accept a peaceful off-ramp when it was clearly marked. "I'm pragmatic," Harlan corrected, leaning forward slightly. He noticed a drop of sweat making its way down the kid's temple, despite the clean duster. The boy was nervous. The bravado was a thin veneer over a pulsing vein of adrenaline. "I know that if we do this, one of us is going to lie on this dirty floor, leaking blood and screaming. It smells like piss and cheap beer down there. It's a terrible place to die. I don't want it to be me, and I honestly don't want it to be you. Stand up, Wade, the kid demanded, ignoring the warning. He widened his stance, dropping his right hand to hover an inch above the pearl grip of his revolver. Harlan looked at the boy's hand. The fingers were long, uncalloused. The muscles in his forearm were tense, locked up tight. He was gripping too hard in his mind before he even touched the gun. Listen to me, son, Harlan said, keeping his voice low, almost intimate. Gunfighting isn't what they write about in those dime novels. It isn't a flash of glory. It's loud, it's messy, and usually it's just about who gets lucky. I don't need luck, the stranger sneered. Harlan slowly pushed himself off the stool. His knees popped in protest. He felt a twinge in his left calf. He stood at his full height, which was still imposing, though his shoulders were permanently slumped forward from the weight of the years. He didn't wear a duster. He wore a faded chambray shirt stained with sweat under the arms and a plain, scuffed leather rig. His revolver, an old peacemaker with a blued steel finish that had worn down to a dull gray over time, sat comfortably on his right hip. He didn't tie the holster down to his leg. He hated the restriction. What's your name, boy? Harlan asked. Doesn't matter, the stranger said. After today, I'll just be the man who killed Harlan Wade. It matters to the undertaker, Harlan replied dryly. He charges extra if he has to put John Doe on the marker. The kid's eyes narrowed. The bravado was cracking, revealing a hot, chaotic fury underneath. He wanted the legend, but the legend was just a tired old man making jokes about funeral expenses. It was ruining his script. The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle, ready to snap. The air was suffocating. A floorboard creaked near the back wall as someone shifted their weight. The sound was as loud as a cannon shot in the quiet room. Harlan felt the familiar shift in his own body. Despite his reluctance, despite the ache in his bones, the old instincts began to boot up. His vision narrowed, the peripheral edges going slightly blurry as his focus locked onto the kid's right shoulder. You didn't watch the hands. Hands could deceive you. You watched the shoulder. The shoulder always telegraphed the movement. His breathing slowed. The smell of the stale beer faded, replaced by the sharp metallic scent of his own adrenaline. Last chance, kid, Harlan said softly. Walk out those doors. Have a long, healthy life. The Nameless Gunman let out a short, breathy laugh. He settled his weight, dropping his center of gravity slightly. The smirk widened, showing too many teeth. Draw first, it won't matter, the Nameless Gunman smirked. It was a bold claim, a cinematic line meant to terrify. But as Harlan stood there, 20 feet of scuffed pine separating them, he didn't feel terror. He felt a profound sense of irritation. The kid's posture was completely wrong. He was standing too square. His feet were planted wide, giving him stability, but locking his hips. If he missed his first shot, he wouldn't be able to pivot or move. He was a stationary target, and his hand. It was hovering too high, angled slightly inward. He was going to drag the gun up in a wide arc, wasting precious fractions of a second. Harlan processed all of this in the space between heartbeats. His mind, sharpened by decades of paranoia, ran the terrible, clumsy arithmetic of violence. The kid was young. His reflexes were undoubtedly faster. If they both moved at exactly the same time, the kid's raw nerve conduction speed would probably win out. But gunfights were rarely about raw speed. They were about economy of motion. They were about not snagging the front sight on the lip of the leather. They were about keeping your eyes open when the concussive blast of the black powder hit your face. Harlan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He relaxed his shoulders, letting his arms hang entirely limp at his sides. He looked broken, defeated. The kid saw the slump. He saw the perceived weakness. His eyes dilated. The right shoulder dipped. Now. Harlan didn't think about his hand. If you thought about the hand, you were too slow. He thought about the target, center mass, just below the sternum where the canvas duster parted. His body moved on agonizingly familiar autopilot. His right hand snapped up, not in a blur, but in a tight, efficient, viciously controlled punch downward toward the grip of his peacemaker. The kid was moving fast, faster than Harlan had anticipated. The pearl-handled Colt cleared the kid's holster with a smooth hiss of leather. But Harlan's draw was ugly. It was gritty. It was born of necessity, not practice in a mirror. He didn't pull the gun up. He threw his hips backward slightly, creating space, and levered the heavy barrel out of the rig. His thumb caught the hammer, racking it back as the barrel leveled out. The mechanical clack-clack of the sear engaging was loud, a brutal metallic snap. Time dilated, turning the air to thick water. Harlan saw the kid's gun rising. The barrel was coming up, aiming for Harlan's chest, but the kid was bringing it up too high, aiming with his eyes instead of his body. Harlan didn't wait to align the sights. He pointed with the heavy iron frame, feeling the balance of the weapon in his scarred hand. He felt a sudden sharp spasm in his right forearm, a cramp born of age and dehydration. His grip faltered for a microsecond. Damn it, he thought. Not now. He compensated, squeezing his middle and ring fingers tighter against the wooden grip, muscling the barrel back into line. It was imperfect. It was a sloppy correction. The kid's gun roared. A deafening crack split the heavy air of the saloon. A brilliant flash of orange flame erupted from the kid's barrel, instantly obscuring his lower face in a cloud of acrid gray smoke. Harlan felt the violent rush of air as a .45 caliber slug tore past his left ear, so close he heard the angry hiss of the lid cutting the atmosphere. The concussive wave slapped his cheek. The sound of shattered glass erupted behind him as the bullet annihilated the mirror above the bar. The kid had fired a fraction of a second early. The fear had overridden his discipline. He had yanked the trigger while the barrel was still traveling upward. Through the stinging smoke and the ringing in his ears, Harlan squeezed his own trigger. The heavy recoil of the peacemaker punched back into his aching knuckles, sending a jolt of pain all the way up to his shoulder. The boom was thunderous, vibrating in his chest cavity. The smoke between them thickened. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. Harlan stood rigid, thumb already instinctively pulling the hammer back for a second shot, the gun leveled into the gray haze. His ears were screaming with a high-pitched ringing. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder choked the room, instantly overpowering the scent of stale sweat. The smoke began to clear, drifting lazily toward the open rafters. The Nameless Gunman was still standing. He was still in his wide stance. His right hand was still gripping the pearl-handled Colt, but the arm was slowly lowering. Harlan kept his sights trained on him. He didn't lower his weapon. He knew better. The kid blinked slowly. The smirk was gone. It had been wiped away, replaced by a look of profound, childlike confusion. He looked down at his chest. Dead center, just below the sternum, right where the canvas duster parted, a dark, wet stain was rapidly blooming on his white cotton shirt. It spread outward, thick and heavy, turning the fabric a deep, glossy crimson. The kid opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a wet, bubbly exhalation escaped his lips. The pearl-handled Colt slipped from his fingers. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, dull thud. The boy looked back up at Harlan. The flat, unreadable blue eyes were now wide, filled with a sudden, desperate realization of his own mortality. The cinematic illusion had shattered, replaced by the terrifying, painful reality of perforated flesh and failing organs. His knees buckled, not gracefully, but abruptly, like a marionette with its strings cut. He dropped straight down, his shins slamming against the hardwood. He stayed upright on his knees for a second, swaying, before his torso folded forward. He hit the floor face first, right next to a brass spittoon. The saloon was utterly silent, save for the ringing in Harlan's ears and the soft, wet, ragged sound of the boy trying to draw breath into lungs that were rapidly filling with blood. Harlan didn't holster his gun immediately. He took a slow, deep breath, tasting the metallic grit of the powder. His right hand was trembling slightly. The cramp in his forearm pulsed with dull, throbbing pain. He looked down at his own chest, checking himself out of pure habit. No blood, just the old, faded chambray. He slowly lowered the hammer on his revolver, the clicks echoing in the quiet room. He slid the warm, heavy iron back into its leather home. He felt a deep, overwhelming exhaustion wash over him, heavier than the Texas heat. He looked at the body on the floor. The kid's boots were still clean. He had drawn first. He had been fast, but Harlan was right. It hadn't mattered. Harlan turned back toward the bar, ignoring the terrified stares of the patrons creeping out from the walls. He looked at Clem, who was pressed flat against the liquor cabinets, staring wide-eyed at the shattered mirror and the dead boy. "Clem," Harlan rasped, his voice raw, "pour me another rye and send someone for the undertaker. Tell him we got another John Doe." Flies possessed a morbid intuition. The solitary buzzer that had been pestering Harlan's glass abandoned the rye, tracing a jagged flight path across the saloon to land squarely on the back of the dead boy's neck. Soon, others joined it, slipping through the cracks in the walls and the gaps in the swinging doors. Clem set a fresh glass on the scarred pine. His hands shook so badly the bottle rattled against the rim, spilling an amber puddle that quickly soaked into the wood grain. Harlan didn't reach for it right away. He stood perfectly still, letting his heart rate slowly decelerate. The frantic booming rhythm in his chest was fading, replaced by a hollow, cold ache. He pinched the bridge of his nose, squeezing his eyes shut. The high-pitched ringing in his ears gradually gave way to the returning sounds of Bitter Creek. A horse whinnied out in the street. A wagon wheel crunched over packed dirt, and inside the yellow rose, the terrifying creeping shuffle of men, realizing they had survived another day. No one spoke. The silence was thick, saturated with the sharp acidic smell of burnt black powder and the heavy, sweet copper stench of fresh blood. It was pooling rapidly beneath the kid, a dark, spreading stain that crept toward the brass spittoon. Harlan opened his eyes and picked up the glass. He downed the rye in one continuous swallow. It didn't burn this time. It just tasted like wet sawdust. "Get a mop, Clem," Harlan said. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. The bartender swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sheriff's coming. Heard the shot." Harlan merely nodded. He turned his back to the body, resting his elbows on the bar. He felt an intense, burning itch between his shoulder blades. Sweat plastered his chambray shirt to his skin. He was so incredibly tired. The saloon doors slammed open, bouncing hard against their hinges. Sheriff Cobb stepped into the room. Cobb was a large man who had let himself go to seat around the middle, his badge pinned to a sweat-stained suspender. He carried a double-barreled shotgun broke open over his left arm, more out of habit than anticipation of a fight. Cobb stopped just inside the doorway. His eyes swept the room, taking in the cowering patrons, the shattered mirror behind the bar, and finally, the motionless lump of canvas and denim on the floor. He let out a long, wheezing sigh that stirred the ends of his walrus mustache. "Damn it, Harlan," Cobb muttered. He broke the shotgun closed with a heavy metallic clack, resting the stock on his hip. "It ain't even noon." He was thirsty, Harlan said, keeping his back to the room. "And in a hurry." Cobb walked over to the body. His heavy boots crushed pieces of broken glass into the floorboards. He didn't bend down to check for a pulse. You didn't need to be a doctor to recognize the finality and the unnatural angle of the boy's neck and the sheer volume of blood soaking into the floorboards. Cobb nudged the pearl-handled Colt away from the kid's outstretched hand with the toe of his boot. "Who is he?" Cobb asked, looking up at the ceiling as if the answers were written in the rafters. "Didn't catch his name," Harlan replied. "Said it wouldn't matter. Said he was going to be the man who killed Harlan Wade." Cobb snorted, a wet, ugly sound. "Well, he got half of it right. He ain't nobody now." The sheriff turned toward the pale faces lining the walls. "All right, show's over. Gideon, go fetch Brimley. Tell him to bring the handcart. The rest of you drink up or get out. Ain't a theater." The patrons scattered like roaches exposed to the light. They didn't run, but they shuffled quickly out the back door or slipped past Cobb into the glaring street, heads down, avoiding eye contact with the corpse and the man who made it. Harlan reached into his pocket, his stiff fingers fumbling past a few loose cartridges to find a silver dollar. He slapped it down on the bar. It landed in the spilled rye with a dull smack. "Keep the change, Clem," Harlan said, "for the mirror." "Mirror costs more than $1, Harlan," Clem pointed out, his voice barely a whisper. "Then consider it a down payment on the next one," Harlan countered, pushing himself off the bar. His knees popped. The cramp in his forearm had settled into a dull, pulsing ache that radiated down to his twisted knuckles. Cobb watched him walk toward the door. "You sticking around, Harlan? Or do I need to wire the circuit judge to tell him you ran off again?" "I live at Mabel's boarding house, Amos," Harlan said, not stopping. "I ain't been on a horse in 3 months. Where exactly do you think I'm running to?" "Just checking," Cobb called out after him. "I gotta go through his pockets. If he's got kin, I'm putting your name on the telegram." Harlan pushed through the swinging doors, stepping out into the brutal, blinding furnace of the street. He didn't answer the sheriff. He just pulled his hat down, low over his eyes to block out the glare. The dust immediately coated his lips. He spat a thick wad of saliva into the dirt, watching it ball up in the dry earth. Tuesday was barely half over, and he already owed for a mirror. Mabel's boarding house smelled eternally of boiled cabbage and lye soap. To Harlan, it was the perfume of sanctuary. He climbed the narrow wooden staircase to the second floor, taking it one step at a time. His left hip, where a rusted piece of shrapnel from a skirmish down in Sonora still resided, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic intensity. He gripped the banister tightly, letting his upper body take some of the weight. His room was at the end of the hall. Room number 4. The door squealed on dry hinges as he pushed it open. It was a small, suffocating box under the eaves of the roof. The heat trapped up here was staggering, baking the air until it felt thick enough to chew. A narrow bed with a sagging iron frame sat against one wall. A washstand, holding a chipped porcelain basin and pitcher, stood against the other. A single window, coated in a layer of grime that diffused the sunlight into a sickly yellow haze, looked out over the alleyway behind the saloon. Harlan closed the door and slid the iron bolt home. The click was deeply comforting. He moved to the bed and unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy leather rig, weighed down by the iron of the peacemaker and loops of brass cartridges, slipped off his hips. He let it fall onto the mattress with a heavy, muffled thud. He felt an immediate physical lightness, as if a 10-pound weight had been lifted from his spine, but the mental weight remained. He walked over to the wash basin. He poured tepid water from the pitcher, watching it splash against the chipped porcelain. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing forearms crisscrossed with thin white lines and darker puckered craters of old bullet wounds. He plunged his hands into the water. He grabbed a sliver of harsh lye soap and began to scrub. He scrubbed his knuckles, working the coarse lather into the swollen joints. He scrubbed the webbing between his thumb and forefinger, where the hammer of the gun rubbed the skin raw. He scrubbed until the water turned a cloudy, grayish brown. He brought his hands to his face, breathing in. Underneath the caustic smell of the soap, it was still there. The sharp, acrid scent of sulfur, the burnt, metallic tang of black powder. It never completely washed off. It seeped into the pores, baked into the skin over years of violence. It was the smell of a localized apocalypse, clinging to him like a second shadow. Harlan dried his hands on a rough cotton towel. He walked back to the bed and sat down. The springs groaned in protest. He reached for the gun belt. He didn't draw the peacemaker. He unholstered it carefully, treating it with a strange mixture of reverence and deep, abiding hatred. It was a tool, just a piece of machined steel and carved wood. Yet, it dictated every aspect of his miserable existence. He broke open the loading gate. He half-cocked the hammer and rotated the cylinder, pushing the ejector rod to pop the spent brass casing out. The empty shell tumbled onto the quilt, smelling sharply of fresh smoke. He extracted the remaining 5 live rounds, lining them up neatly on the bedside table. From a small wooden box under the bed, he pulled a glass bottle of solvent, a brass cleaning rod, and a stack of small, square cotton patches. The ritual began. Harlan worked methodically. He threaded a patch, dipped it in the pungent solvent, and ran it down the barrel. The first patch came out pitch black, thick with carbon and lead fouling. He tossed it into a small tin bucket near his feet. He ran another and another. His mind wandered as his hands performed the mechanical task. He thought about the kid's eyes right before he folded. The sudden, terrifying clarity. The arrogant boys never believed they could bleed until they felt the wet warmth soaking through their shirts. They thought it was a game of cards where you could just fold and walk away if you drew a bad hand. They didn't realize the table was rigged and the house always took its cut. Harlan ran an oiled patch through the cylinders, wiping away the dark rings of soot. He checked the action, cocking the hammer and letting it fall with his thumb to feel the sear engagement. It was smooth, perfect. The machine had performed flawlessly. The failure was entirely human. His grip had faltered. He had nearly died because his forearm decided to cramp. He stared at his right hand. He hated this hand. He hated the way it curled inward when it rained, the way the knuckles swelled and throbbed in the cold. It was a murderer's hand, ugly and ruined. He reloaded the revolver, slipping the 5 brass cartridges back into the chambers, leaving the hammer resting on the empty 6th chamber. It was a habit born of an era when a bumped gun could blow a hole in your own leg. He slid the iron back into the leather. Harlan lay back on the bed, not bothering to take off his boots. He stared up at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the buzzing of a fly that had managed to follow him up the stairs. He closed his eyes, waiting for sleep to claim him. He knew it wouldn't. It rarely did on the days he fired the gun. He would lie here, sweating in the suffocating heat, listening to the phantom echo of a gunshot that had already faded into history. An hour passed, maybe 2. Time in the sweltering room dilated, stretching into a meaningless expanse of heat and dust motes. A heavy rhythmic pounding on the wooden door shattered the quiet. Harlan opened his eyes. He didn't move. His right hand instinctively drifted toward the holster lying beside him on the bed, but he stopped himself. He recognized the heavy, flat-footed tread in the hallway. "Amos," Harlan called out, his voice thick with disuse. "Door's open. The bolt ain't thrown." The handle turned, and the door pushed open. Sheriff Cobb filled the doorframe, bringing with him the smell of stale tobacco and horse sweat. He stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim yellow light of the room. He held his battered Stetson in one hand, wiping his glistening forehead with the back of his sleeve. "Hotter than Hell's Kitchen up here, Harlan," Cobb muttered, stepping inside and pulling the door shut behind him. "Keeps my joints loose," Harlan said, slowly pushing himself up to a sitting position. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Brimley get him planted?" "Dug the hole, waiting on the sun to drop a bit before we put him in the dirt," Cobb said. He walked over to the washstand and leaned against it, taking the weight off his bad knee. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, folded bundle. He tossed it onto the bed. It landed next to Harlan's thigh with a soft slap. It was a small canvas pouch, stained with dirt and dark, dried flakes of blood. "What's this?" Harlan asked, not touching it. "His pockets," Cobb said heavily. $4.12, a pocket watch that don't tick, and that. Harlan looked at the pouch. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He didn't want to know. He never wanted to know. The anonymity was the only thing that made the killing tolerable. If they were just nameless ghosts, they didn't haunt you as badly. "I don't want his money, Amos. Give it to Brimley to cover the box." "Brimley took his boots," Cobb said, crossing his thick arms. "Said they were good leather, almost new. That covers the pine. The money is yours. Spoils of war, or whatever you want to call it." "I call it blood money, and I don't want it," Harlan snapped, a sudden spike of anger cutting through his exhaustion. "Take it away." "There's a letter in there, Harlan," Cobb said softly. The sheriff's tone lost its usual gruff edge. It was quiet, almost gentle. That scared Harlan more than the gunfight had. Harlan stared at the pouch. "I don't care." His name was Tommy Miller. The name hung in the stagnant air. Harlan felt the blood drain from his face. The knot in his gut twisted violently, turning into a block of jagged ice. "Miller," Harlan repeated. The word tasted like ash. "Yeah," Cobb nodded slowly. I reckon he was the youngest boy. The one that stayed back with the mother when the older brothers rode out to rob the Denver Pacific down by the canyon. The ones you shot to pieces 5 years ago. Harlan closed his eyes. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. 5 years ago. A blinding rainstorm. 3 men pinned behind a rocky outcropping, their rifles spitting fire into the mud. Harlan had flanked them, belly crawling through the freezing muck. He had emptied his peacemaker into their backs. It wasn't a duel. It was an extermination. It was the job he was hired to do by the railroad. He wasn't there for a reputation, Cobb continued, his voice relentless in the quiet room. He wasn't trying to be the fastest gun. He was just a kid trying to settle a family debt. He bought that fancy rig and that pearl-handled gun just for you, Harlan. He was a fool, Harlan whispered. His hands were shaking again. He clenched them into tight fists, pressing them against his thighs. Maybe, Cobb agreed, but he was a brave fool, or a desperate one. The sheriff pushed off the washstand and headed for the door. Read the letter, Harlan, or burn it. I don't care. But the town council is meeting tonight. People are getting tired of scrubbing blood off the floorboards. You might want to think about finding a new place to rest your knees. Cobb opened the door and stepped out into the hall. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. I'll register the kill as self-defense. Plenty of witnesses saw him draw first. You're clear with the law. The door clicked shut. Harlan sat in the suffocating heat for a long time. He stared at the stained canvas pouch. The buzzing fly landed on it, crawling over the dried blood. Slowly, painfully, Harlan reached out and picked it up. He untied the leather string. Inside, nestled with the cheap broken watch and the silver coins, was a folded piece of paper. He pulled it out. The paper was cheap lined stock. It was crumpled and smoothed out multiple times, the creases soft and worn. Harlan unfolded it. The handwriting was blocky, uneven, the letters pushed hard into the paper with a dull pencil. It wasn't a manifesto. It wasn't a declaration of vengeance. Ma, I made it to Bitter Creek. The train ride was awful dusty. I bought the gun like I said. The man at the store said it shoots straight. I feel sick to my stomach, Ma, but I have to do it. I have to make it right for the boys. I can't sleep thinking about them in the mud. I'll be home by Sunday. Please don't slaughter the brindle calf yet. We might need the milk if things go wrong and I have to run. Tell Sarah I'm sorry I missed the dance. Tommy. Harlan lowered the paper. The words blurred as a sudden sharp sting hit the back of his eyes. Damn it, he breathed into the empty room. It was the terrifying mundanity of it. The kid had ridden halfway across the state to commit murder, and he was worried about a brindle calf and missing a local dance. He was just a boy, wrapped in a canvas duster, playing a fatal game of dress-up because he thought blood demanded blood. Harlan looked down at his own hands, the hands that had pulled the trigger, the hands that had orphaned mothers, widowed wives, and ended family lines. He crumpled the letter in his fist, the cheap paper crackling loudly in the silence. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall, listening to the relentless mocking buzz of the fly. He had won the draw. He had survived. But as the heat pressed down on him, Harlan Wade knew with absolute certainty that he was already a dead man. He was just waiting for the dirt to finally catch up. Packing took less than 3 minutes. Harlan owned a change of long johns, 2 spare shirts, and a shaving kit that smelled faintly of stale bay rum and rusted tin. He rolled them tight in a wool blanket, tying the bundle off with a frayed length of hemp rope. That was it. 40 years of breathing dirt and dodging lead, reduced to a cylinder of scratchy wool he could carry under one arm. He didn't bother changing his shirt. The sweat had dried, leaving stiff, salty white rings under his armpits. He picked up the crumpled letter from the bed, his thick fingers smoothing out the harsh creases. He folded it carefully, meticulously, following the original lines worn into the paper, and slid it into his breast pocket. It sat heavy there, right over his heart, a phantom bullet that had bypassed his ribs and lodged itself permanently in his chest. Heat radiated off the warped floorboards of the hallway. Harlan descended the stairs sideways, keeping his right leg stiff to spare his ruined knee. Mabel was waiting at the bottom, her arms crossed over a faded gingham apron. She was a stern, leathery woman who had buried 2 husbands and a son before she turned 40. She didn't look angry, just terribly resigned. "Sheriff came by," Mabel said. Her voice was flat, devoid of judgment or sympathy. "I know," Harlan muttered. He reached into his pocket and fished out the $4.12 that had belonged to Tommy Miller. He pressed the coins into her calloused hand. "For the room. And for the trouble." Mabel looked down at the silver. She knew where it came from. Everyone in Bitter Creek knew. She didn't refuse it. Pride didn't put flour in the larder. "You riding out?" "Seems best for everybody," Harlan said. He didn't meet her eyes. He looked at a knot in the floorboards near her heavy black shoes. "Town council is jumpy," she stated, slipping the coins into her apron pocket. "They want the railroad money to build a proper schoolhouse. They don't want investors stepping off the train and twisting their ankles on dead boys in the saloon." "Can't blame them." Harlan shifted his bedroll to his other arm. "Tell Clem I'll send money for that mirror when I find work." Mabel scoffed, a dry, dusty sound. "Clem's an idiot. He should have charged that boy double for a drink before you shot him. Ride safe, Harlan." Harlan tipped the brim of his hat and walked out the front door. The afternoon sun was a brutal, blinding hammer. The shadows in the street were growing long, stretching out like dark fingers clawing at the dirt. He didn't head for the livery stable right away. He turned left, walking slowly toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrub brush and the rocky incline of Boot Hill. The graveyard didn't have a fence. It was just a patch of hard-pan dirt where the mesquite roots grew thick and stubborn. Wooden crosses, bleached bone-white by the sun, stood at drunken angles. Most of the names carved into them had already been sanded away by the wind. Brimley, a rail-thin man with hands stained permanently black from coffin varnish and boot polish, was leaning on a shovel near a fresh mound of earth. He was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, the paper glowing bright orange in the fading light. "You missed the words," Brimley rasped as Harlan approached, exhaling a thin stream of gray smoke. Reverend Stokes came by, said a quick psalm, mumbled mostly. Guess he didn't feel like wasting good scripture on a stranger. Harlan stared at the fresh dirt. It was darker than the surrounding crust, clods of clay and rocks piled haphazardly. There was no marker yet, just a raw, ugly scar in the earth. "He wasn't a stranger," Harlan said quietly. "His name was Tommy Miller." Brimley raised a sparse eyebrow, coughing into his fist. "Miller. Well, I'll be damned. One of those Millers? The ones you—" He trailed off, waving a dirty hand in a vague gesture. "Yeah." "Huh." Brimley flicked his cigarette butt onto the fresh grave. It landed near the head. "Ain't that a kick in the teeth? Reckon I should carve the name then. Usually charge 2 bits a letter, but seeing as he provided his own boots for payment, I'll throw it in for free." Harlan flinched slightly when the cigarette hit the dirt. He took a step forward and crushed the smoldering butt under the heel of his boot, grinding it deep into the soil. "Make it read right, Brimley," Harlan said, his voice thick and rough. "Tommy Miller, don't misspell it." "I know how to spell Miller, Wade," the undertaker grumbled, picking up his shovel. "You want to say a few words? You're the one who put him here." "No," Harlan said. "Words won't fix a damn thing." He turned away from the grave, the ache in his hip flaring up, a hot, stabbing pain that shot down his thigh. He walked back toward the livery, his shadow stretching out long and thin in front of him, mimicking the posture of a crippled, broken man. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Saddle leather creaked, a dry, protesting sound that grated against Harlan's nerves. The roan gelding he rented from the livery was old, blind in the left eye, and smelled heavily of sweat and damp hay. It walked with a slight limp, favoring its front right hoof. They were a matched pair, Harlan thought bitterly. 2 broken-down beasts carrying too much mileage. Bitter Creek disappeared behind a rise 2 hours ago, swallowed up by the rolling, dusty plains. The sun had finally broken its fever, dropping low on the horizon and painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. Riding was torture. With every lopsided step the gelding took, a jolt of pain radiated up Harlan's spine. He shifted his weight constantly, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate the shrapnel in his hip or the swollen joints in his knees. His right hand, the hand that had pulled the trigger that morning, rested on the saddle horn. It throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. He kept clenching and unclenching his fist, trying to work the stiffness out, but the knuckles remained rigid, refusing to cooperate. He was heading south, toward the border maybe, or maybe just toward the next empty stretch of dirt. He didn't have a plan. Men like Harlan rarely did. They just moved until the past caught up, and then they shot their way out or died trying. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of sagebrush and distant, unseen rain. Harlan pulled his collar up, shivering slightly as the temperature began to plummet. The desert was a place of extremes. It boiled you alive during the day and tried to freeze your blood at night. He rode until the light bled entirely out of the sky, leaving a canopy of cold, indifferent stars. He found a small depression near a dry wash, a place shielded from the wind by a crescent of jagged sandstone rocks. It was a miserable campsite, completely devoid of water, but he lacked the energy to search for anything better. Dismounting was a dangerous, clumsy affair. Harlan swung his right leg over the cantle, his knee buckling slightly as his boot hit the uneven ground. He grabbed the saddle to steady himself, his breath catching in his throat as a white-hot spike of agony lanced through his lower back. He stood there for a full minute, leaning against the horse, waiting for the pain to subside into a tolerable throbbing baseline. He unsaddled the roan with slow, deliberate movements, dropping the heavy leather rig into the dust with a muffled thud. He hobbled the horse, giving it a handful of oats from a canvas sack, listening to the rhythmic, comforting sound of the animal chewing. Harlan gathered a few brittle sticks of dead mesquite and built a small, miserable fire. It didn't provide much heat, but the flickering light pushed back the suffocating darkness of the plains. He sat cross-legged on his bedroll, groaning as his joints settled into the hard earth. He didn't eat. He wasn't hungry. His stomach felt like it was filled with jagged rocks. He reached to his side and unbuckled his gun belt. The peacemaker was heavy, a dense block of cold iron and worn wood. He laid it gently on the blanket next to his thigh. It was a reflex, an action ingrained so deeply in his muscle memory it bypassed conscious thought. A man didn't sit in the dark without iron close at hand, but as he stared at the gun, illuminated by the meager dancing light of the fire, a wave of profound nausea washed over him. He saw the kid's face again. Tommy Miller, the arrogant smirk melting into absolute terror, the wet, bubbling sound of his ruined lungs fighting for air, the dark stains spreading across the clean white cotton. Harlan closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyelids, until bursts of jagged color exploded in his vision. God Almighty, he whispered to the empty desert. The sound of his own voice was pathetic, thin and fragile. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the folded letter. The paper was warm from his body heat. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He had memorized the clumsy, blocky handwriting. Please don't slaughter the brindle calf yet. We might need the milk. The sheer devastating innocence of it. Tommy hadn't been a killer. He had been a farm boy, drowning in grief and misplaced duty, trying to avenge brothers who had been little more than thieving, murderous thugs. Harlan knew the older Miller boys. They were vicious. They had shot a train conductor in the face for a handful of silver watches. They deserved the lead Harlan put in them. But Tommy didn't. Tommy was just collateral damage in a cycle of violence that Harlan had helped perpetuate. Harlan stared at the fire. He held the letter out, hovering the edge of the paper inches from the yellow flames. It would be so easy to burn it, to watch the words curl and blacken, turning into ash that the wind would scatter across the scrub, to erase the tangible proof of his guilt. He held it there for a long time. The heat licked at his knuckles. Slowly, his hand trembling, he pulled the letter back. He couldn't do it. Burning the paper felt like killing the boy a second time. It felt like cowardice. He folded it carefully and slid it back into his pocket, settling the weight back over his heart. He deserved the ache. It was the only honest thing left in him. A sharp snap of a twig breaking jerked Harlan out of his thoughts. His right hand shot out, moving with terrifying, unconscious speed. His fingers wrapped around the grip of the peacemaker, thumb automatically racking the hammer back. The heavy double click of the sear was loud in the quiet night. He leveled the barrel toward the shadows just beyond the firelight, his breath held, his eyes scanning the darkness. Silence stretched. The wind rustled the dry sagebrush. Harlan didn't move. He kept the gun steady, ignoring the sudden cramp flaring in his forearm. From the shadows, a low, pathetic whine emerged. Harlan narrowed his eyes. He slowly lowered the barrel an inch, keeping his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. A shape materialized on the edge of the firelight. It wasn't a man. It was a coyote. It was a miserable, skeletal creature, its fur patchy and matted with dirt. Its ribs protruded sharply against its flanks, and its left hind leg was drawn up tightly against its belly, useless and mangled. It stood there, trembling violently, staring at Harlan with large yellow eyes reflecting the flames. It was starving. It had smelled the horse, or maybe the grease on Harlan's boots. Harlan looked at the animal down the barrel of the heavy revolver. It would be a mercy kill. One squeeze of the trigger, a loud crack, and the creature's suffering would end. It was the pragmatist's solution. It was what Harlan did best. His finger moved to the trigger. The metal was cold against his skin. The coyote whimpered again, taking a tiny, agonizing hop forward, its nose twitching. It wasn't aggressive. It was just desperate. It was broken. Harlan stared at the animal. He saw the ruined leg. He saw the exhaustion in its posture. He saw the sheer naked will to simply exist for one more miserable day. He slowly lowered the hammer on the peacemaker. He rested the gun back on the blanket. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of hard, salted beef jerky. He broke off a chunk, his stiff fingers struggling with the tough meat. He tossed it underhand. The jerky landed in the dirt about 5 feet from the coyote. The animal flinched, instinctively cowering away from the sudden movement, but the smell of the meat hit its nose. It froze. It looked at Harlan, then at the jerky. Slowly, agonizingly, it limped forward, snatched the meat from the dirt, and scurried back into the absolute darkness, vanishing like a ghost. Harlan let out a long, ragged breath. He leaned back against his saddle, pulling his wool blanket tightly around his shoulders. He was cold, he was tired, and he was entirely alone in a massive, uncaring landscape. He had spared a crippled scavenger, but he knew it didn't balance the ledger. The morning sun brought no warmth, only a harsh, glaring light that made Harlan's eyes water. His body was stiff, a collection of rusted hinges and bruised muscles. It took him 3 agonizing tries to get back into the saddle, his bad knee screaming in protest, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. He rode south. The terrain grew harsher, the rolling plains giving way to jagged ravines and dry, cracked earth that looked like shattered pottery. The horse stumbled frequently, its blind eye making it hesitant and clumsy. Harlan didn't push the animal. They moved at a slow, plodding walk, 2 specters drifting through the wasteland. He thought about Bitter Creek. He thought about the yellowed, cracked mirror behind the bar. He wondered if Clem had swept up the glass yet. He wondered if Mabel had rented his room to someone else. It didn't matter. The town was already fading from his memory, becoming just another coordinate on a long map of places he could never return to. By mid-afternoon, his throat was coated in a layer of fine, chalky dust. His canteen was half empty, the water inside tasting strongly of hot tin. He took a small sip, swishing it around his mouth before swallowing, trying to conserve every drop. He crested a rocky ridge and pulled back on the reins. Below him, stretching out for miles, was an ancient dry riverbed. It was a massive scar cut deeply into the earth, filled with bleached white boulders and twisted dead cottonwood trees that looked like reaching skeletal hands. It was a hard country, a place that didn't tolerate weakness or hesitation. Harlan stared down into the gorge. He felt the heavy weight of the peacemaker resting against his right hip. The leather holster had molded perfectly to his thigh over the years, becoming a parasitic extension of his own body. He reached down and rested his hand on the wooden grip, the scars on his knuckles lined up perfectly with the worn grooves in the wood. "Draw first," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It won't matter." The kid had been right, just not in the way he thought. It didn't matter who was faster. It didn't matter who walked away. The act itself was the poison. Every time he pulled the trigger, he killed a little piece of himself, replacing it with cold, unfeeling iron. He had survived 23 gunfights, but he was more dead than the men he had buried. He was a ghost, haunting his own life. Harlan drew the revolver. The metal hissed smoothly against the leather. He held it out in front of him, staring at the blued steel. It was a beautiful, terrible machine. He looked down into the deep, rocky gorge. He could throw it. He could unlatch the loading gate, dump the cartridges into the dirt, and hurl the heavy iron frame as far as he could into the jagged rocks below. He could ride away empty-handed. He could finally be done with it. He imagined the satisfying clatter the gun would make as it struck the stones, bouncing and tumbling into the darkness, lost forever. He imagined the sudden liberating lightness of an empty holster. His grip tightened on the wood. His knuckles turned white. He lifted his arm, aiming the gun toward the bottom of the ravine, preparing to throw. But his hand wouldn't release. His fingers were locked tight around the grip. The cramp in his forearm flared, a sharp, familiar pain, but it wasn't the muscle holding him back. It was the sheer, paralyzing terror of being unarmed in a world that only spoke the language of violence. If he threw the gun away, he was just a crippled, tired old man with a bad hip and no friends. He would be easy prey for the wolves, both the two-legged and four-legged varieties. The iron was his curse, but it was also his only anchor to existence. He hated it, but he needed it. He was trapped. A dry, bitter laugh escaped his lips, sounding like rocks grinding together. It was the laugh of a man who finally understood the punchline to a terrible cosmic joke. There was no redemption. There was no peaceful sunset to ride off into. There was only the road, the dust, and the agonizing wait for a bullet that would finally be fast enough to retire him. Harlan slowly lowered his arm. He didn't drop the gun. With meticulous mechanical precision, he slid the heavy revolver back into the leather holster. The click of the gun seating itself was final, like a jail cell door slamming shut. He patted his breast pocket, feeling the crinkle of the letter through the fabric of his shirt. The brindle calf, the dance, the boy who died on a dirty saloon floor because he thought vengeance was a noble pursuit. Harlan clicked his tongue, giving the reins a gentle shake. The old roan gelding snorted, tossing its heavy head, and began the slow, treacherous descent down the rocky slope toward the dry riverbed. Harlan didn't look back at the horizon. He kept his eyes fixed on the dirt directly in front of him, riding deeper into the shadows. He didn't know where the riverbed led, and he didn't care. He was just a man carrying a heavy load of iron, dragging the ghosts of Bitter Creek behind him, waiting for the dust to finally settle. If Harlan's journey through the brutal, unforgiving reality of the West struck a chord with you, hit that like button to let us know. The frontier isn't about glory, it's about survival, and we want to keep bringing you stories that pull no punches. Share this video with a friend who appreciates grounded, gritty drama. Most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the dust, blood, and broken anti-heroes of the wild frontier. What did you think of Harlan's final choice? Sound off in the comments below.